What a fascinating program ahead of us. I'm Anton Fedyashin, a professor of history here at American University and the executive director of the Initiative for Russian Culture, which is organizing, hosting, and fully supporting this event. Exactly a year ago, we were across the hall for our first symposium, which explored overcoming Cold War stereotypes. And we had current former ambassadors participating in that. We had representatives of the US State Department and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs from Russia participating in it. We had young scholars from AU, MGIMO University in Moscow, CSAS, and the Carnegie Endowment for Peace participating in it. And we're following up on the success of last year's symposium with a celebration today of the 50th anniversary of John F. Kennedy's commencement address on our campus in June of 1963. We are a cultural program. We focus on the role of culture in international affairs, and it is very appropriate that we are talking about JFK today because a large part of his speech was dedicated to the encouragement of dialogue on all levels, political but also cultural, which was very important in 1963. Last year we had a reception after our symposium, and we will follow that tradition this year, so I invite you all to join us at the Katzen Arts Center at 6 o'clock for a magnificent reception for this symposium and the commemoration of JFK's speech. Last year, we also celebrated the dedication, the foundation of the Susan E. Lehrman Chair for Russian History and Culture at our university, which my colleague, who I think is here by now, Eric Lohr, there he is, occupies, a good friend and an excellent scholar of Russia. None of this would have been possible without the support of Susan Lehrman, whose generosity and visionary philanthropy have allowed us to maintain a remarkable momentum with the Initiative for Russian Culture. So Susan is somewhere here. I'm just not seeing. There she is. Thank you. The IRC is partnered with some pretty impressive cultural institutions, the Library of Congress here in Washington, D.C., the Mariinsky Theater in St. Petersburg, the Hillwood Museum here in Washington, D.C., and the list will continue to grow, I assure you. We have partnered with the Russian Embassy, where cultural attaché Pavel Spitsin has done an enormous amount of work. There he is, to make sure that our events run smoothly and that everyone enjoys themselves. We have screened 11 films. This is the end of our second year, including a marathon screening of Sergei Bondarchuk's War and Peace, 7.5 hours. And no, we did not do it in one sitting. We broke it up. But the whole day took about 9 hours. It was one of the most successful events that we have had. We have had about just over 8,000 guests at our events in 2 years. That includes students from all the consortium universities of the Washington, D.C. area, and of course guests, adults. And many of the students that you see here are veterans of IRC events, including many of the volunteers whom I would like to thank for giving their time and energy to helping us organize a great event. So thank you, all of you guys, especially those in the Student Historical Society at AU, and my former students, sadder but wiser, all of them. The last thanks goes, and certainly not least, goes to the ambassador of the Russian Federation, His Excellency Sergei Kislyak, who is here with us and will say a few words. Mr. Kislyak is a world-renowned diplomat. He was the Russian ambassador to Belgium and the permanent representative of Russia to NATO. He was the deputy foreign minister of Russia, and in July of 2008, he arrived in Washington, D.C. as an ambassador. From my perspective, as someone who runs a cultural program, of his many achievements, the greatest and the dearest to my heart is that he has turned the Russian embassy here in Washington, D.C. into a cultural institution. And this is in a town which is famous for its world-class cultural institutions such as the Library of Congress, the Smithsonian, and the Kennedy Center. His generosity and the openness with which the Russian embassy has welcomed so many of our guests is in large part responsible for the magnificent momentum of his program. And so it is my pleasure to introduce Ambassador Sergei Kislyak. Will you say a few words?
Thank you, Anton, for this a wonderful presentation. To be honest, I didn't expect to be given the floor right now, but I'm honored to be able to welcome all of you for this conference and to say a couple of words about the program that we are happy and honored to cooperate with and the goals that we are all pursuing. And it would be very much in line with the subject of today's conference, because the Culture Initiative and our cooperation with the American University are about building better understanding between youngsters of both countries. We certainly try to give American students a chance to learn more about Russia, sometimes, and in majority events in Russian embassy, to see Russia, Russian history, Russian culture through Russian eyes, because we present Russian movies that are discussed by the students, and that is a series of events that gives them a glimpse of a fantastically rich, sometimes dramatic, but otherwise very familiar for American life, because the life of people in Russia, in the United States, or anywhere else in the world, very much the same values, family ties, and the love, challenges of peace and war. Everything is very, very similar between Russian and Americans, and sometimes very different. But at the same time, there are a lot of things that is a good basis for uniting our countries. And I would say that the challenges of today is another reason why we need to work together on those rather than against each other. 50 years ago, President Kennedy most probably was the first American leader who understood the need to change mentality. 50 years after his speech, it most probably would be difficult to understand how revolutionary it was for the American political environment. Most probably it was revolutionary for Russian perception of what the Americans were. I wouldn't say that had I been placed in the political environment of 50 years ago, I would welcome each and every sentence in this speech. But 50 years ago, afterwards, you certainly understand it was a turning point in relations between us. It was also about the things that we are talking about now. Working with each other rather than against each other. Even at that time, when there was a Cold War, President Kennedy advocated trying to convince each other rather than fighting each other. So that was the first statement, as far as I understand, that laid down on American side the vision of peaceful coexistence. It was the first speech that was advocating arms control instead of launching war to impose your will. So 50 years afterwards, it's certainly a very interesting moment to look backwards, to look in the future, and to try to understand how the world has changed during these 50 years and what hasn't changed. And I would say that since then, we have accomplished a lot in terms of building a culture of arms control, and that was started by the initiative of 50 years ago with the suspension of the nuclear testing in the atmosphere. It was revolutionary at the time. Currently, nobody tests among the legitimate nuclear weapon countries. However, have we done everything? Of course not. Because even today, the United States hasn't ratified the comprehensive test ban treaty 50 years after President Kennedy initiated the movement towards this goal. And we are yet to achieve a non-proliferation goals in the world that would help us to be sure that the others are not going to test either. But what is important, that since this initiative that was supported by 3 nuclear powers of the time, the culture of regulating arms rather than relying solely on arms competition has become a reality. And it's something that we have built upon our relations with the United States for a long period of time. It's something that we are doing even today, because we are in the midst of the implementation of the treaty to reduce strategic nuclear weapons that was signed 3 years ago and then entered into force a year ago. And I would tell you that this treaty is being implemented in full both by the United States and Russia, and we on the Russian side at least are very much satisfied with the way it is developing. But this moment, looking backwards and looking in the future, certainly it's a good moment to think as to what it is that we failed to achieve. What are were expectations 50 years ago among those who were trying to start building peaceful coexistence rules, and whether we have moved further than that, whether we have achieved 22 years after the end of the Cold War a state of affairs where the stereotypes of the Cold War are not haunting us. I'm afraid we are not yet there. 50 years after the beginning of the movement from the abyss of the nuclear war to something that would be more reliable, predictable, and a basis for coexistence that would be more predictable and reliable for all. So, having said so, I wouldn't claim that I have an ultimate truth to share with you about what was the importance of this speech. Most probably there will be many more specialists who would give you much, much better view of what it was. But being a practitioner working today in Russian-American relations, I would say that 50 years since then were painful, were difficult. We have lived through ups and downs. We have lived through wars. We have ended the Cold War. But we are still working on issues that were present there and are still continue today. And we are still locked in the mutually assured destruction posture in Russian-American relations, 22 years after the end of the Cold War. We are yet to learn how to move away from that, how to start living in a post-Cold War environment that would be really based on a different and more, I would say, proactive kind of cooperation between our two countries rather than just living in respectful coexistence. So thank you very much for inviting me for this event, and I'm looking forward, as all of you, to hear from the wise men as to what is the importance of this wonderful speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Before we go to our distinguished panelists, we wanted to show you a short clip, 9 minutes, of the Kennedy speech itself. For those of you who have not had the chance to read it or ever see it or listen to it, it will set the tone for our discussion, and it will create a reference point that I hope will encourage you to ask questions of our panelists. So here we go. Thank you.
It is discouraging to think that their leaders may actually believe what their propagandists write. It is discouraging to read a recent authoritative Soviet text on military strategy and find on page after page wholly baseless and incredible claims, such as the allegation that American imperialist circles are preparing to unleash different types of war, that there is a very real threat of a preventative war being unleashed by American imperialists against the Soviet Union, and that the political aims, and I quote, of the American imperialists are to enslave economically and politically the European and other capitalist countries and to achieve world domination by means of aggressive war, unquote. Truly, as it was written long ago, the wicked flee when no man pursueth. Yet it is sad to read these Soviet statements, to realize the extent of the gulf between us. But it is also a warning to the American people not to fall into the same trap as the Soviets, not to see only a distorted and desperate view of the other side, not to see conflict as inevitable, accommodation as impossible, and communication as nothing more than an exchange of threats. No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. As Americans, we find communism profoundly repugnant as a negation of personal freedom and dignity. But we can still hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science and space, in economic and industrial growth, in culture, in acts of courage. Among the many traits the peoples of our two countries have in common, none is stronger than our mutual abhorrence of war. Almost unique among the major world powers, we have never been at war with each other, and no nation in the history of battle ever suffered more than the Soviet Union in the Second World War. At least 20 million lost their lives. Countless millions of homes and families were burned or sacked. A third of the nation's territory, including 2/3 of its industrial base, was turned into a wasteland, a loss equivalent to the destruction of this country east of Chicago. Today, should total war ever break out again, no matter how, our two countries will be the primary target. It is an ironic but accurate fact that the two strongest powers are the two in the most danger of devastation. All we have built, all we have worked for, would be destroyed in the first 24 hours. And even in the Cold War, which brings burdens and dangers to so many countries, including this nation's closest allies, our two countries bear the heaviest burdens. For we are both devoting massive sums of money to weapons that could be better devoted to combat ignorance, poverty, and disease. We are both caught up in a vicious and dangerous cycle, with suspicion on one side breeding suspicion on the other, and new weapons begetting counterweapons. In short, both the United States and its allies, and the Soviet Union and its allies, have a mutually deep interest in a just and genuine peace and in holding the arms race. Agreements to this end are in the interests of the Soviet Union as well as ours, and even the most hostile nations can be relied upon to accept and keep those treaty obligations, and only those treaty obligations, which are in their own interest. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal. Third, let us re-examine our attitude towards the Cold War, remembering we're not engaged in a debate, seeking to pile up debating points. We are not here distributing blame or pointing the finger of judgment. We must deal with the world as it is, and not as it might have been, had the history of the last 18 years been different. We must therefore persevere in the search for peace, in the hope that constructive changes within the communist bloc might bring within reach solutions which now seem beyond us. We must conduct our affairs in such a way that it becomes in the communist interest to agree on a genuine peace, and above all, while defending our own vital interests. Nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world. To secure these ends, America's weapons are non-provocative, carefully controlled, designed to deter, and capable of selective use. Our military forces are committed to peace and disciplined in self-restraint. Our diplomats are instructed to avoid unnecessary irritants and purely rhetorical hostility, for we can seek a relaxation of tensions without relaxing our guard. And for our part, we do not need to use threats to prove we are resolute. We do not need to jam foreign broadcasts out of fear our faith will be eroded. We are unwilling to impose our system on any unwilling people, but we are willing and able to engage in peaceful competition with any people on earth. Meanwhile, we seek to strengthen the United Nations to help solve its financial problems, to make it a more effective instrument for peace, to develop it into a genuine world security system, a system capable of resolving disputes on the basis of law, of ensuring the security of the large and the small, and of creating conditions under which arms can finally be abolished. At the same time, we seek to keep peace inside the non-communist world, where many nations, all of them our friends, are divided over issues which weaken Western unity, which invite communist intervention, or which threaten to erupt into war. Our efforts in West New Guinea, in the Congo, in the Middle East, and the Indian subcontinent have been persistent and patient, despite criticism from both sides. We have also tried to set an example for others by seeking to adjust small but significant differences with our own closest neighbors in Mexico and Canada. Speaking of other nations, I wish to make one point clear. We are bound to many nations by alliances. These alliances exist because our concern and theirs substantially overlap. Our commitment to defend Western Europe and West Berlin, for example, stands undiminished because of the identity of our vital interests. The United States will make no deal with the Soviet Union at the expense of other nations and other peoples, not merely because they are our partners, but also because their interests and ours converge. Our interests converge, however, not only in defending the frontiers of freedom, but in pursuing the paths of peace. It is our hope and the purpose of Allied policy to convince the Soviet Union that she too should let each nation choose its own future, so long as that choice does not interfere with the choices of others. The communists' drive to impose their political and economic system on others is the primary cause of world tension today. For there can be no doubt that if all nations could refrain from interfering in the self-determination of others, the peace would be much more assured. This will require a new effort to achieve world law, a new context for world discussions. It will require increased understanding between the Soviets and ourselves. An increased understanding will require increased contact and communication.
Well, there it is, 10 minutes of a speech that lasted just over 20 on a hot summer day, in case you couldn't tell, as Washington summers always are. It is my pleasure now to invite our first distinguished speaker after John F. Kennedy, and that is Sergei Nikitovich Khrushchev. Dr. Khrushchev worked in the Soviet Missile and Space Program. He is currently a member of the Slavic Languages Department at Brown University. He has taught at the Naval War College for the past 12 years. He was senior fellow at the Watson Institute for International Affairs between 1996 and 2012. He has helped edit his father's memoirs, Khrushchev Remembers. He's just finished a trilogy about his father in the Russian language, and he was one of Nikita Khrushchev's most close confidants when he was growing up. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Sergei Khrushchev. Thank you.
Thank you, Anton, for this introduction. It's very generous. So it is difficult to start this talk, but I will try not compete with the president because very impressive speech, but I will try to explain how it looks from the Soviet side. But to understand this, we have to make one step back and look in the transition from the beginning of the Cold War to the 1963. Because we talk about Cold War, we have to understand that the Cold War was an actual transition in the world history from the period where we resolved our problem between superpowers with the real war. It was World War I, World War II. And then after the appearance of the nuclear weapons, political leaders understood that now you will lose more than you will gain. But they didn't know how to behave in this environment. So same behavior, but without war. And so it was this confrontation all the time. And of course, it became more dangerous when in 1953, John Foster Dulles introduced the policy on the brink of the war. So we have to balance on the brink of the war on the both sides. It was very dangerous, but also very interesting in the political way how you can manage it. Of course, if we're looking this from the historical perspective, that we know that we are still alive and nothing happened at that time. And we have to remember also the problem between these two countries, because after Second World War, it was two new powers, United States and Soviet Union, who tried to adjust to each other in the world politics. And my father, Nikita Khrushchev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union at that time, he wanted to be recognized as equal. And you know that United States don't want to recognize anybody as equal. And if you're not recognized as equal, you are challenging opposite side. You're doing this in class, you're doing this everywhere in sport. And it was in the politics, so it was the policy of crisis. Endless crisis, Berlin crisis, Middle East crisis. By the way, 1957, Syrian crisis, the same story like we face now. No? Too many things changed. And then we turn to the Cuban Missile Crisis, the peak of the history of crisis. What was this crisis about? It could happen everywhere because it's one of the crises in all this chain. But in 1961, at the time of the Bay of Pigs, Fidel Castro officially announced that he joined Soviet bloc. And that put burden on the Soviet Union to protect them, because it was the responsibility of superpower to protect all their allies. It was Soviet Union policy toward the Cuba was very similar to the American policy to the West Berlin, as we heard just a minute ago. It was small, useless piece of land, deep inside hostile territory. But if you'll not protect it, you will lose your face. And so Khrushchev wanted to send the same messages that the president did, and he sent his missiles to Cuba. It was diplomatic message: don't invade Cuba, we are strong. It has nothing with the balance of power. It has nothing with infiltration to the South America. It was nothing with the bullying, so-called weak American president. All this is mostly fantasy. It was the peak of this crisis, a most very dangerous crisis, also because it was American psychological crisis. When Americans first time recognized that had to be killed the same as others, because in previous crises they thought the Europeans will kill each other, and Americans, the people, I'm not talking about White House, will watch this on TV. And it has created even more dangerous environment, because with strong pressure on the White House, eliminate them, take these missiles out of the island. And we were lucky that these two leaders were balanced, and there was not, as the idea first shoot and then think. They prefer to negotiate. And it was the beginning of negotiation with the introducing the quarantine, because we can translate it, will not allow your ships that carry weapons to go through this line, and we can find how we'll deal with each other. And Khrushchev understood this, and he stopped these 13 vessels that carry weapons, but he told all other ships will go through the quarantine because it is our international rights to use this. And Kennedy responded in the same way. And I can talk endlessly about all these stories. It's very interesting. But it was a story where it was shown that negotiations between two leaders can find the resolution of the crisis. Because it's like bargaining. You cannot just have everything what you wanted in the beginning. But through this, they came to the conclusion that America will not assure, will not invade Cuba, what was the goal sending their missiles, and the Soviet Union will take these missiles out. But it was in the peak of the Cold War. In this negotiation with two adversaries, in the heat of this Cold War, created new trust. New trust, that this trust was just ended in 1963 with the nuclear test ban treaty in the atmosphere. Soviet Union signed peace treaty with the East Germany, with GDR, without any scandal. Before it was many scandals. They created the direct line, just renting pair of the wires from the Western Union. And because other way they waited in line in London when they will send their messages, which was in line other urgent messages. And they started to talk about possibility to send the mission to the moon together. So it was many things what could happen through the cooperation between these two leaders. And we heard this, just the speech of the President Kennedy. It was in April. And in March, my father, Nikita Khrushchev, he spoke on the Defense Council of the Soviet Union. And he told there that we are different with the President Kennedy. We defend our valuables. He defends his valuables. But we have one in common. We can work together to prevent the war. Just the same words, just months before this. But it was not only words. At that time, he told that to do this, we have to decide what we need for the security. And he told that if we'll have 500 intercontinental nuclear missiles, it will be enough. We'll stop their production, and we can reduce Soviet armed forces to less than 1 million and stop production of the most of the conventional forces. Because he told that not that political system or economical system would win that will have more military power. It was that system that present better life to the ordinary people. And through this, military spending is just outsourcing the economy. It's just wasting these resources, and we have just to reduce this spending. And it was possible if this policy will implement, and they thought they will stay in power another 6 years. The Cold War will finish in the 1960s, and the Soviets and the Americans together will step on the moon. At that time, when we talked about this, Khrushchev foresee intuitively that we are moving from the different competition from the Cold War with military competition in the economical competition, in competition where that country that have stronger economy will be on the winning side, what we face now. And also, the Cuban Missile Crisis show that these two leaders can negotiate and they can find how to deal with each other. It is very important now, because now we think that we have negotiated with the friends. It's not negotiation, it's just a party. We, at that time, they thought you have to negotiate with adversary. All of them was very different. There was, I don't think that it was very, very pleasant to them personally just to discuss with each other when each of them have many complaints on each other. But they understand only this can just better understand opposite side, to present their own position, to influence on the opposite side and avoid mistakes. Because you remember, the President Kennedy told in all this negotiation, we have to keep door open. And Khrushchev told all the time, most dangerous if one side will push other side in the corner. It can bring us to the war. We can just find out how we can bargaining, how we can find the resolution of any of these confrontation. And it was the successful foreign policies creating friends, unsuccessful creating enemies. And it was, we knew these lessons where it was very successful political move of the United States. It was not only Kennedy and Khrushchev. You have this brilliant idea of the Henry Kissinger and Nixon when they just go to China. I don't think that they like Mao more than Kennedy liked Khrushchev, and change the world upside down in the interest of the country. It's very different from the current, what we have to know in there, the idea of the conditional surrender. Or, because unconditional surrender is just pushing you to obtain nuclear weapons because you cannot surrender. We know only two examples of the unconditional surrenders. It was Germany and Japan after 5 years of the war when they were fully defeated. And this is working in the interest of the hawks of the opposite side, because this united people to resisting this. The same the sanction. I remember the sanction and this push pressure on the Soviet Union when it was the Congress, when they discussed all the time how many Soviet cities can be destroyed. It depends how many bombs at that time Soviet Union had in the 40s and 50s. And of course it was one of the motivations Soviet Union to build the nuclear weapons. And so here it is, we have to find out how we can deal with this. Don't push these people into the corner. I don't want to talk about current policy, but we just did this with North Korea. Because we imposed sanction, the young leader who was not experienced responded in this way. Now we don't know what to do. We cannot negotiate with them now because it will be unproductible. And we're begging Chinese. I heard on TV today that we are just pressing Chinese. We cannot press Chinese because we borrow money from them. We're begging them just to do something for this, and they're smiling on us and saying, yes, we'll see, maybe we'll do something, maybe not. But it is very dangerous, because if you're in the corner, United States can have no possibility to squeeze the open door. North Koreans also, it can bring us to the war. And what will be the war? Of course, we will win this war, but it is more important not the victory on the war, what will be after. And then we'll spend trillions and trillions of dollars on the restructuring of the North Korea, the same as we did with all other countries. Here the problem, that you have to think what will be after all these things. What will be if we will start war against Iran, and how many money we will spend after this. And I'm talking about this not because I want to discuss the current events, even I'm very much interested in this, but I'm thinking that these lessons from 1963 is very important to our contemporary policy. This is important that you have to negotiate. You have to negotiate and you have to find out how you can deal with this. And I'm repeating it, I was talking about negotiation between President Reagan and Gorbachev. When they, with all their differences, they came to some conclusion peacefully, not sending each other in the corner. Even we can say that Gorbachev surrender or not surrender, but it was no difference. It was the interest of the peace. It was peaceful resolution of all these crises. So I say that would the Khrushchev and Kennedy stay in power, then next 6 years, as my father expected, we would live in the different world. Unfortunately, in the November 22nd, president was assassinated. In the October 1964, Khrushchev was ousted of power, and now we have what we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khrushchev. And now for our third and last speaker of the first panel, it's my pleasure to introduce to you James W. Symington, who had been the director, a long career, and I'll just mention the highlights. The Deputy Director of the Food for Peace Program, the Administrative Assistant to Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, Chief of Protocol at the State Department for a while, and then elected from the 2nd District of Missouri to the U.S. Congress as a representative in '68, served from '69 to '77. He is currently the chairman of the American-Russian Cultural Cooperation Foundation. And last November, the Initiative for Russian Culture awarded its first annual James W. Symington Award to an American university student who will be going over to Russia this summer with that money and studying at McGill University Summer School. So we're putting boots on the ground in the best possible sense of the word. Mr. Symington, please.
Thank you, Anton. A young man who's headed to Russia will be following in the footsteps of a Missourian who was there in 1958, как студент, as a student, to see what was going on. You know, heard a lot of things that were happening, and thought it would be a good idea to meet the Russian people. And I had a grand experience from beginning to end. Might be, I wonder if I push this button, will something happen? Well, that's a little earlier. I was still in the Columbia Law School, but I was also singing in New York. And the fellow on my right is Sergei Obolensky, who ran the marvelous Russian Prince. Great man, fought his way through the Bolsheviks, got out of Russia as a young man, and married an Astor girl, and was given some hotels to run. So he was my boss, and perfectly marvelous man. Okay, let's see what happened then. Oh, that's interesting. It shouldn't be there. But let me leap into that moment. In 1961, President Kennedy asked his staff for ideas because he was about to go and see Premier Khrushchev, and what should he take up with him? I was working for George McGovern, who was the director of Food for Peace. A new program had been set up whereby agriculture and state and AID worked together to provide food to needy countries, because we had a lot of it, a lot of surpluses. And McGovern said, why don't you research the Russian-American partnership after the First War, in which Russians were starving, millions. I think 4 million were in the danger of starving, and Herbert Hoover was put in charge of the American Relief Commission. His mission was to bring food, and did so to Russia. So McGovern would say, why don't we take that's the spirit of that, and see what we can do today with Russia, rather than clenching fists, but shake hands and see what we can do for lesser countries of less advantage. Poor countries. Russian doctors, American food, all could work together. And that is what that memo really says. Points out what we did before, what we can do again. So let's do it. And that memo went in. But you know, President Kennedy had an awful lot to do without thinking about soft solutions. He had tough people with him, probably thought it was a harebrained idea. But it was certainly near the beginning of my feeling that working with Russia is a good idea and might be productive as we go along, because we're both good countries, good people. By that time, I hadn't seen Russia, but I decided to go. Oh, excuse me, I had. In 1958, that is when I decided to go. Why? Just to look around, see, meet people, and did so. And went to Kiev, Moscow, Leningrad, took my guitar into the park, sat down, and sang songs. And, will that show up here? No, that's another one. Well, there I am, sitting around, looking important there. I guess the Church of the Redeemer, I guess, in Leningrad. I hope that's right. And then I'm getting ready to sing a song for these kids, wondering what to do. And then they all came around. See, the minute I started, the old people came around, and because they didn't know what to make of this American kid until the children told them, "Come on around, listen." Don't you love those faces? And I had a great time. Keep singing Moscow Nights, that kind of stuff. An American song, I'm going away for to stay a little while. To put dust on my shoes. A wonderful little song. And let's see, Rumpf. Well, there's another little shot of it. Don't you love the kindly face of that lady? This is just a bunch of guys I met on the street. And we had quite a time. There was an American car nearby, and they were standing around it, and a rather officious gentleman came along and said, "Move out, get away." And they said, "What has he said?" And I said, "He told us to get away." "We will not go away, as this is our street." So I thought that was pretty good. This is a gang I met in the park. I invited them up to my hotel room. And actually, I'm visiting their place now, first. These are Moscow University students. What a time we had. Let's see now. This young man in the middle there, next to the girl, he said to me, I sing American song. I said, "No kidding. What is it?" He said, it's Bing Crosby. You know Bing Crosby? I said, "Well, I don't know him personally, but he certainly is a well-known singer." I sing what he sings. "I could have told you long ago." So I said, "Okay, hit away." "I could have told you long ago. You meant to me." I thought, God, this guy would be a sensation if I could just read him in New York. But we had a grand time. Then I did become chief of protocol, and Premier Kosygin came along. And I'm on the left there with his very lovely daughter, Ludmila. That was the Glassboro Talks visit by Kosygin. And we had a grand time. We took them all to eat in a marvelous restaurant, but there were two things to eat: steak and lobster. And in order to facilitate the ordering, if you wanted lobster, you went like that. And if you wanted steak, like that. So, all these things could be helpful, I'm sure, in diplomacy. There is the great Ambassador Brennan, and we have a great Ambassador Kislyak here, who I meant to acknowledge instantly. This nice man is standing in front of a painting called Forest Fire by a Russian artist in the 19th century named Igor Denisov, I think, or Ural Denisov, excuse me. And why is it there? Well, I'm in Congress at this point. I think we're looking around 1972 or something. And I noticed from a little Missouri bulletin that this painting had been part of the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904. Thank you. That's my wife, my Jana, очень важный person. So in 1904, St. Louis, the site of the fair, asked all countries to send their stuff and set up a wonderful exhibit. Russia was not inclined to do it, but they were finally said, "Okay, we'll send." So they sent 100 paintings by the Russian masters to this country, and to cut to the chase, none of them were returned. A gentleman handling them was not all he should be, and he sold them into private hands, which I discovered, this particular one, because I was visiting Gussie Bush, the head of Bush Brewery in my good hometown of St. Louis. I hope you all drink Busch Bavarian beer or Anheuser product. And I said, Gussie, you ought to, because this painting was in the lobby. That's where I first saw it, of his beautiful office there downtown. And I said, you ought to give this back. You know, returning stolen stuff is a good way to make friends. And he said, what is the advantage to me? Can you imagine asking a question like that? So I said, well, you know, you're doing good things for your country. It's diplomatic. It's détente. It's all the good things. And but he said, but I couldn't. He couldn't give it away. He couldn't. So I finally talked him into, yes, you've got to give it away. You've got to give it to the United States government. That was it. If you give it to a foreign country, you don't get the tax advantage. But if you give it to, but if you give it to your own country, you do. Now it's coming back to me. Yes. So why don't you give it to your own country? So who could? Where's Joe Duffy? Is he in the crowd today? Well, he was then the head of humanities. I said, Joe, will you take this painting and will you give it, please, to the Russian ambassador? He did. So this was the event of turning it over to Ambassador Dobrina. I think it now sits in the Museum of Russian Art. That Moscow. Where's my friend? Yeah, okay. So, you know, just one little thing. And then Ambassador Dobrina said, now, Jimmy, where are other 99? So one thing at a time. Well, and I suppose I should get to my text at some point here. Well, you know, you saw that picture of President Kennedy. Giving his talk. And so what I have written here, we are surely on hallowed ground, made so by President Kennedy's historic commencement address to the 1963 graduates of American University. Kindly in spirit, prescient in understanding, steadfast of purpose, it laid out a course and set of principles for U.S.-Russia relations that have stood the test of time. Think of the perilous period that preceded it, one of the most dangerous in our history. On assuming office, our new president, no doubt mindful of his inaugural pledge to bear any burden, pay any price in defense of freedom, must have felt politically compelled to redeem that pledge when called upon to do so at the very outset of his presidency. Approving, therefore, albeit reluctantly, the fundamentally flawed Cuba Libre plan, prepared under the leadership of his predecessor, battle-tested, trusted, revered soldier, statesman, our newly elected, untried president set in motion a sequence of events ranging in gravity from the acutely embarrassing to the existential. The failure that attended the resulting Bay of Pigs debacle required humiliating negotiations to effect the return of the captured survivors of the ill-fated brigade of expatriate Cuban volunteers. Trained for their mission by U.S. advisors, they indulged in the misplaced confidence that U.S. air cover would be provided to enable them to gain a foothold on the island. Defeated and captured, their ransom was achieved at the cost of something like $53 million of food and medical supplies. These arrangements, I say to the students in this room, check your history, brought to my mind the particulars of a comparable exercise in 1850, when a boatload of American volunteers from the South, expressly forbidden to do so by law, landed in Cuba to take it away from Spain. Overwhelmed at once by superior Spanish forces, a few were executed, the remainder sent to prison in Spain, to be ultimately repatriated at considerable cost to our treasury. Unremembered history, well repeated. I was with Bob Kennedy when he received the leaders of the returning brigade, who dropped by his office to vent their frustration, but also to express their appreciation for negotiations that led to their release. This sad chapter had barely closed when photos taken from the high-flying U-2 spy plane identified missile sites on Cuban soil. Apparently, Dr. Castro had thought it prudent to deter further such visits by entering into negotiations with Premier Khrushchev that led to the establishment of a Soviet military presence on the island. This discovery prompted a rebuke before the UN General Assembly by the U.S. delegate Adlai Stevenson, whose bold presentation, complemented by a display of photos, set the stage for the President's decision to dispatch naval units to intercept Soviet ships headed for Cuba and presumably carrying warheads to the missile sites. The ensuing tense confrontation, as we have learned from our guest, featured two messages from the Premier to the President. The first of these offered a compromise solution whereby the Soviet missiles would stand down and personnel withdrawn in exchange for parallel initiatives by the U.S. to remove U.S. missiles in Turkey, the NATO missiles. The second and less accommodating message arrived on the heels of the first. The conditions were ratcheted up, perhaps at the insistence of Mr. Khrushchev's military, who knows. But finessing this more ominous message, the President accepted the conditions specified in the first, a tactic which proved successful. In the meantime, under his order, U.S. naval units intercepted a flotilla of ships, presumably carrying warheads to the missile sites. As such, an initiative on the high seas can arguably be interpreted as an act of war. There began a 13-day period of great uncertainty, nay, dread. Measures were taken to evacuate essential government officials and conduct them to an underground facility in West Virginia. I was grateful to learn that I was not numbered among the designated recipients of this dubious honor, and spent my time preparing our home for the worst. On a visit to Sunny Surplus, an emporium that featured used military supplies, blankets, tents, canned food rations, and other survival items, I encountered a number of my colleagues on a similar mission. Going camping, one asked. Hope not, I said. Albeit unaware, the nation at large was slouching toward Armageddon. That is, until Premier Khrushchev's courageous decision to order his ships to turn around, a decision which may have cost him some confidence of his hardliners in his establishment, but it produced an almost audible sigh of relief all along the Potomac. Members of the President's team met for a private celebratory dinner, and Washington life returned to its steady state of challenges of lesser moment. For my part, I shelved the set of instructions I had prepared for my family in case of attack, which I can reveal on an as-needed basis. Thank you all very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have a few moments for questions, so I'm going to ask Jim and Dr. Khrushchev to please come up, have a seat. There are microphones right in the middle of the halls, and before we repair to dessert, coffee, and tea, or water, if the audience has any questions, please come up to a microphone and feel free to ask. Mr. Ambassador?
Discuss missiles, but sometimes forget that at the same time there was deployment of American missiles in Turkey.
And Italy and Great Britain.
Right, but Turkey was much closer. Perhaps it's almost about the same only than Cuba from the United States. And largely what people, especially youngsters, discuss with the crisis is you can forget about it. But when it comes to the solution of the crisis, a final understanding of how we remove ourselves from crisis situation,
negotiation, we have the substance and entourage. And missiles in Turkey were entourage. Because really, if you talking about, I work with missiles for many years. If you're talking about security of your launch sites, they be on mainland. It's closer there to the hostile territory, easy to destroy them. Why Americans talk that they easily can destroy missiles in Cuba, but they cannot destroy them in Siberia. The same as Soviets can destroy missiles in Turkey, but cannot destroy them in Idaho. So the negotiation talk about basic things. You not invade Cuba, will take missiles out. But then these missiles in Turkey were all the time in the air. And for the ordinary public, we're not now talking about them. They can be very important things. So in the first letter which Khrushchev wrote when they decided orally that now we are ready just to make this deal. We'll not invade Cuba, you will take missiles out. It's appeared these missiles. And it was the Bertrand Russell, British philosopher, wrote about this, New York Times wrote about this, even Pope talked about this. See, it was everybody was involved. And my father asked Ambassador Dobrynin, check it. And he invited, not he invited, they have regular meeting with Robert Kennedy, and he told, what's about the Turkish missiles? And he told, make a call. And he went in the other room, he made the call, came back and told, it's approved, we have a deal. But all the time there were small such things in each of these events that changed everything. One of the Soviet officials at that time gathering around the Washington, collecting information. And he went to the National Press Club where his friend, the barman, who was a Russian. But he was not a Russian spy, as I guess he worked for CIA. And he told this person that, you know, we have here American journalist Rogers, he's making farewell drink, and he then flying to Florida to cover the invasion. And Khrushchev told all the time to Kennedy, we have to avoid first shoot. After first shoot, beginning this, everything change, and the nuclear war will be not unavoidable, because he knew that under the Soviet command there, it was 94 tactical nuclear weapons that can destroy all the invading forces. So these officials came to the Dobrynin, and he sent this message to Khrushchev, and Khrushchev decided to exclude Turkish missiles in his message, not to make it more complicated to Americans, just to sell it, it's native, it's Turkish government. So he dictated his emotional letter that was just typed, made by hand changes, and sent to the United States. And at that time it went in such a way. They sent a Russian message to the American embassy, or Americans to the Soviet embassy, and then they translated, coded, made the telegraph, and then it go to London. And in London, it was in the office of the Western Union, waiting in the line with all other urgent messages. Yes, so this message waited there for 6 hours. By the way, Ambassador Dobrynin in his memoirs wrote, when they sent the Kennedy message to the Khrushchev, they called to the Western Union and they sent message on the bicycle. So it was this long story, and this time go, and another Soviet official called, double check, everybody doing this, called to this journalist Rogers and invite him next day to the lunch. And he accepted this. So it was no invasion. He didn't leave. It was no farewell party. It just small CIA operation just to push Khrushchev a little bit further. And Khrushchev was too scared, too nervous, and he grabbed the first letter that he dictated, including missiles in Turkey and Italy, and sent it by the air
But it was too late, because they tried to without missiles. They started to receive them in the White House, and only two people knew what about these two letters. Why it was letter that included missiles in Turkey. Two brothers Kennedy. But they pretended that they don't know this, because if you accepted low price, your counterpart, why you will then pay higher prices? So they decided just to answer the first letter. And when we talk about the missiles in Turkey, it was the first generation Jupiter missiles. And I lectured, not now, but before, many times about Cuban Missile Crisis. And after one lecture, all gentlemen came to me, shake hands, and told, I'm retired general. I was the commander of the missile base in Turkey. I can tell you, really, our missiles couldn't fly. And I told, well, I can tell you, our missiles also didn't fly. But it was first generation, like the planes of the Brother Wrights from the beginning. So it was two missiles, and then it was asking the question, that they have this, then later they have backdoor agreement secretly. Yes, we will take these missiles out from Turkey if you will take, after you will take your missiles out of Cuba. Really, it's cost nothing to the United States, because they started deployment of the Minuteman II missiles, so inevitably they will take all these missiles out, but it was such step. And here, the people asking me why Khrushchev kept it secretly. It can help here in the propaganda way to say, no, we withdraw our missiles, but Kennedy will take this missile out. I say, you have to understand, but for him, trust of the negotiation with Kennedy much more important than these propagandist efforts. Because if you disclose the secret deal, then you will lose this trust. How they lost mutual trust with President Eisenhower. So he preferred to keep it secret because it's more important to him just to go forward with negotiation with the American president.
Thank you, Dr. Khrushchev.
Can I add to that just a little bit? During that time, I was, of course, with Bob Kennedy, and Ambassador Dobrynin made frequent visits, each time, I guess, modulating the position that, with the initial position that was very, very truculent, confrontational. They got on quite well. I kept bringing him up and down the private elevator to Bobby's office, and naturally you're standing there with this important man wondering what to say. So I presented him with a record of folk songs I had recorded in Missouri, and by golly, the next time he came, he brought a record of Rostropovich, who was then a Russian citizen, worth a great deal more than mine, and so that's how we managed to keep things going. Dobrynin was he later, of course, was the dean of the diplomatic corps, and as such, I saw a lot of him when I was chief of protocol. A great fellow. Saw him again in Moscow, and my wife and I, we drank a little vodka with Dobrynin. It was kind of fun. I'm sorry to interrupt this important conversation.
Matthew.
My question is for Mr. Khrushchev. How did your father's upbringing and his life cultural experiences shape his leadership style and his character?
This is a style of...
How did your father's upbringing and his cultural experience shape your father's leadership methods and his character?
His upbringing, как воспитание сформировало, как его
young man.
My father was the child of the revolution. Like any revolution, he was not experienced. He was the blue-collar worker, very well paid. When he was the head of the Moscow Party Committee, he told that he received less money when he was the metal worker in that time. But he was self-educated, and he was the person who was very creative. He was the master of his foreign policy and domestic policy, trying to absorb all the ideas. You understand, you cannot imagine everything, but you have to talk with the people who are the expert in different fields, in foreign relations, in agriculture, in chemistry, in missiles, and try to bring the best. And he educated very fast, and he became professional in many of these fields. In the foreign policy, he was master of his foreign policy, and he told why he liked Kennedy when they met in Vienna, because he told, before I met with the President Eisenhower, and he respected them as the general, but he told, as the president, I never knew with whom I negotiate, because I asked him question, and he told me 1 second, and then he turned back, and Secretary Dulles gave him a piece of paper, and he read it. So he told, I never knew with whom I negotiate. And here I met the new president, and we talked for 2 days in 2 embassies, and he never asked for the break. He never asked about anybody. And then he asked about a backdoor channel. My father told us, for me it's no difference, backdoor channel or front door channel, I control all these channels. But it was, for him, how to say, he liked this direct negotiation, because through this talking, he can be more creative. You can really understand what opposite side have, introduce your own things. If you talk about his image that he was unpredictable and very emotional, he tried to play these games all the time. But he was a really emotional person, but he was very predictable, and he never made decision under influence of the emotions. But, for example, it was such story when it was the first TV interview, and he was very nervous. First time in the history, you cannot change anything. And so he walked there in his Kremlin office, and the team of the American crew were there with 5 tons of all this equipment next door, and he didn't know what to say. No, it's going back and forth, back and forth. Then he opened the door and started to shout at them, you are here, you are American propaganda, you will ask all the products, many, many things. He shouted for the 3 minutes, and then he stepped back and closed the door, and then they didn't ask any questions. They told us, what you want to say us?
Dr. Khrushchev, thank you for coming here first and foremost. But I want to ask, from what I've heard on the Cuban perspective in this crisis, the Cubans felt as if they'd been betrayed by their Soviet allies. So I actually wanted to ask you, what's your opinion on the Castro government's role in the conflict?
Castro government was never American puppet. It is just misunderstanding, the same as the Soviets thought that the British government was the American puppet. He was independent player, and he wanted to be respected as equal. But from the other side, he was the person who was motivated from his own emotions. And he thought that he is ready to sacrifice his life and life of all the Cubans to the victory of the American imperialism. And he sent this letter just in the end of the crisis to the Soviet Union that invasion inevitable, and I authorize you to make the strike against the United States. And when Khrushchev heard about this, he didn't read this because he was outside Moscow. They read from Foreign Ministry by the telephone. He told, this young man don't understand that we never planned to use these missiles, to launch them. It was only a diplomatic message. So we have to take them as soon as possible, because the same as they shot U-2 with Major Anderson without authorization there, maybe he and Soviet military there under the pressure can launch this and start this war without authorization. At that time, with the lack of the communication, it was big threat that somebody will start this war. And also, it was 2 other things important at that time. It was also a message from the Ambassador Dobrynin about his meeting with the Robert Kennedy, very different that was in 13 days. wrote when they wrote that Kennedy imposed ultimatum. And Ted Sorensen told me, don't trust too much this book, because I edited this when the Bobby wanted to run for the presidency because his memory was way too weak. So he told, I met American President, the Robert Kennedy. He came there very tight with red eyes and told it is strong pressure on the president. He resisted the invasion, but we don't know how long we can resist. And Khrushchev told we have to help Kennedy. And then, as usually it is the last drop, it was the meeting of the Presidium Central Committee, and the president and the representative of the military, and the representative of the military intelligence was there, and he reported to Khrushchev that at 5 o'clock it will be another speech to the nation, same Sunday. And it was about 1 o'clock in the afternoon Moscow time, and it was sent by the military intelligence. And Khrushchev asked General, 5 o'clock Moscow time or 5 o'clock American time? And generals don't want to say, I don't know. So he reported Moscow time. Why Moscow time? It will be. And Khrushchev told, we have to resolve the crisis now, because it's mean that President broken, he announced the invasion, it will be end of the world. Why he sent this message at 4 o'clock Moscow time by the radio there? And then appeared that officer who was in Washington, he just read TV program that the presidential speech what he make week before will be rebroadcasted. So,
Rebroadcast.
so it was this story. And he had no time to send it to the Castro. And he sent then letter to the Castro explaining everything. And Castro was furious. He told that all the time the great nations decided our fate. Before it was United States and Spain, now it is you, and I am an independent country. And he was also pushed by Chinese who told, yes, Khrushchev was scared, they was just pulled their missiles out, we have to be much stronger. It was very strong Chinese influence there. So for my father it was very difficult to convince Castro that it was the right decision, and in reality he had no time to negotiate because he had to send this message before 5 o'clock, and it was no time to discuss this with Castro. And he showed him the Soviet missile sites near the Kalinin Tver, and they also showed them the film about nuclear explosion that it was impossible to use it all the time. And Castro agreed that maybe he was not right, but I don't think that he really agreed with this.
Thank you, Dr. Khrushchev. Let's take a cluster of questions because we're almost out of time and we do want to break for dessert. So can we have the three in a row? Would you guys please identify yourselves?
My question is, it seems to me that one of the most difficult, the biggest difficulties in fostering dialogue between two adversarial nations is domestic politics. For example, Kennedy in 1960 had to portray himself as being tough on communism. Khrushchev had a tough time with hardliners in the Soviet government. So I was just wondering what you had to say about overcoming these domestic political difficulties and accusations of being either soft on communism or soft on the position of the United States, and the attacks that political opponents would describe dialogue and mistake it for weakness, and how to overcome that.
If we talk about this, I think it's been more important the cultural differences. Because, for example, we are making decisions based on our own experience. An American experience very different from the Russian experience or Chinese experience. And we have no other experience. So, for example, when Khrushchev decided that it is very dangerous step to send missiles to Cuba, but he didn't understand how dangerous, because Americans who lived all the time protected by two oceans, it created this psychological crisis. It was ready to move these missiles out of Cuba for any expenses. It was no logic in this time. And when I asked in one of our meetings the same Ted Sorensen why you were so eager to remove these missiles from Cuba, you understood that it was no bigger threat than before. Nobody launched them, and it didn't change balance of power. He explained me, yes, we understood this, but if we'll accept your missiles in Cuba, President will be impeached. So it was very difficult, all these things, more difficult even than to deal with all these domestic rhetorics that opposite leaders didn't take too much in their account. They know that they have to say all these things. The same as the Americans thought that the Castro is the puppet of the Soviet Union, and he doing nothing without Soviet permission. And when Khrushchev gave the order to the Soviet troops not shoot American planes, we close to the resolution of the crisis, Castro gave order to his air defense to shoot all American planes and answered Khrushchev, it's my country, and I'm tired of these planes roaring there. We can imagine what will be reaction in the White House with you two shot, that another plane shot, what the Hawks, what the president will be do. So I think it was more dangerous and more difficult than domestic politics, because you know how to deal with domestic politics, and here it is just the territory that you didn't know.
Can I add a word? The miscalculation that both Castro and Mr. Khrushchev made was that the United States could really stomach such a threat so close to our shores. That was an unwise assumption, because as distinct from European powers, which are constantly on each other's borders, we weren't used to having a threat of that magnitude so close. And I think it just struck a nerve, not only in the president, but in the American people. So it was that was the misjudgment that you referred to. They didn't calculate the resistance to the presence of a, potentially destructive force so close to our shores.
Even if it was only 20 minutes difference in delivery, missiles from Cuba and missiles from from Russia.
Let's take the next two questions together, if you don't mind, and then we'll wrap up and we'll break for coffee and dessert.
My question is, Baron Bird paying President freedom, Marco speech. My understanding is that was a oblique reference to Vietnam, or at least it was understood in some way to be a reference to South Vietnam. And that in fact, Norman Horace spoke about why we were in Vietnam. He said our whole discussions with the Kennedy White House revealed that he's made that commitment or that assertion because he actually believed the exact opposite. He really didn't want to give enormous resources to Southeast Asia, but the U.S. was like. My question is, what was the Russian interpretation? What did the Russians think in terms of Kennedy's intentions on that? Was he really, did they think that he was going to bear any burden, or did they believe the opposite?
Well, you shouldn't be asking me what the Russians were thinking. Maybe that's for...
At that time, the Vietnam was not primary focus of the Soviet Union, because at the beginning of all this dispute with Mao Zedong, and from that perspective, 1962-63, that Vietnamese are very close to the Chinese, and in reality helping Vietnamese, we are supporting Chinese. So Khrushchev, after Cuban Missile Crisis, preferred to stay aside of all this conflict there, just looking how it will develop and then to decide. And everything and decisions of the Soviet military support to the Vietnamese was made after Khrushchev was ousted of power in 1965, when Kosygin flew there and beginning this constant flow of missiles and weapons there.
But I'll play that later.
And let's have our last, do you have anything to
No,
add to that? Let's have our last question quickly.
Just to bring it back to present days, don't you think that there is a disconnect between the politicians and the population?
Ask me, I don't think that it was a disconnect between politicians and the people, because it is different people everywhere. You have the hawks and doves everywhere, and you have, of course, the people who are just feeling the same lonely because they lost their enemy. How can live without enemy? I designed cruise missiles for the Soviet submarines, and after the end of the Cold War, my friends told, now we don't know how to design them, because before we have the sample, it was Saratoga aircraft carrier, and we have this radar image of this, and we designed this missile. Now, what we have to use this? By the way, my friend, Professor Darian from Brown, he wrote about American training now, and they're still training war against the Soviet Union after the 20 years, because they have no other enemy. And in many aspects, when we are talking about these problematic relations with Iran, Syria, or Libya, it is one of the problem of the superpower. They think their resources is unlimited. It's my personal opinion, but I think that United States and United States government still try to teach these rulers. In 1950, you choose the wrong side. You Syria, not were with us. You Iranians, just it was this hostage crisis, and we'll show this. Not taking very realistically, it's a different generation, and you have negotiate with them, finding how to deal with them, not thinking what that leader that was there was not existed now. Nobody even remember there who was the Syrian leader in 1957 when they made this decision. But still, we are living in this impression, and I think it is counterproductive, because I told you have to negotiate with them directly. I will say some thing that will be felt unacceptable here. But to resolve the crisis with the Iran, maybe the American president have to say, I want to visit Iran and talk with them. He told, no, it's impossible, it was there. Ahmadinejad, Ayatollahs, yes. But remember, it was the same relations between Soviet Union, the Stalin, and Yugoslavia. The President Tito was the bloody dog Tito who is killing there. And then in 1955, Khrushchev told we have to rethink these relations. We have to improve. There's a stronger position of all the hardliners. And then they told, yes, we have to invite Tito to Moscow. And he told, no, we are a great country. I'm not care what they say about me, because I know that I am leader of the great country. And he, the leader of the small country, will he come here, just it will be some harm for him coming to Moscow to renegotiate this thing. I will go there, I will apologize. And he came there, and after that it was very different relations. It is one of these, I think, very bold things and the wise thing of the great country. I can do it that you cannot. It is the same that we have this expression, who blink first. And my father knew this expression, and he told, yes, sometimes you're blinking first not because you're weaker, but because you're wiser.
Just to follow up on that very wise observation, there was Churchill, some of you may remember, who said it is better to jaw, jaw, jaw than war, war, war. And there's another thing that your question brought to mind. We do have to be concerned that there are elements in our society that haven't grown up from the Cold War. One of them was actually running for president not too long ago, who described Russia as our biggest problem. And I thought, gee, where's this guy been, And he should have been in the park with me singing songs. He wouldn't feel that way.